Hello, I'm Mary O'Rourke Kaplan, and today we're working on the Bustier project. This is a top, and I'm ready to finish making my pattern for the garment. We have an external garment, we have a support bodice, and now to finish that garment, we're going to make the lining and facing unit for the inside. To do that pattern, you need to utilize your support bodice because it's the closest to the body, and the lining is going to be on the inside of that, so you don't want it any bigger than the support bodice. But you might notice that the garment lands further down the body than the support bodice, so that pattern alone is not going to be adequate to complete the pattern for the lining. There's several choices, but one is to drape a yoke that starts at the support bodice, at the waistline, and goes to this hem that's marked on the form, and that's the method that I utilized. But you could also have started when you did your support bodice. You could have draped the support bodice as a princess line all the way down to the hemline, but be sure and mark your waistline for the stopping of your boning. The way that I did it, I draped a yoke that fit to my support bodice at the waist and came down to my hemline, and I added that ease, the wearing ease of a 1/4 inch tuck, which equals a 1/2 of an inch takeout in each quadrant of the side front and the side back. So I take this drape and transferred it to a pattern and created my lower facing. So what I want to do is, the rest that I need to do is my lining pattern and my neckline facing. To do a neckline facing for this princess line and to reduce bulk, we want to eliminate this seam in our facing. The way you can find out if you can eliminate the seam is to know your seam allowance is a 1/2 an inch, and if you draw a line that is double that width on one of the pieces, draw that 1 inch parallel to the cut edge, and then overlap your pattern piece that sews there to that line. And you can see that it starts to spread away here where you get into more fit. There's curve, and that's not going to be overlapped 1 inch beyond this notch. But what tells me that I can eliminate this seam is that I want a 1.5 inch facing, which is going to be up here, and all of that overlaps very evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and make a 1-piece front facing for this. So in order to do that, we line up the pattern, fold center front, overlap to that line, and then trace the side seam and the neck edge. Give yourself this notch where the princess seam is. And then we just need to draw the depth that we want. If we want a 1.5 inch finished viewable facing, then we need to add on our seam allowances. And our neckline has a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And at the bottom of the facing, you need to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance to join your lining. So that's going to be 3/4 that I'm going to add to that. So 3/4 and 1.5 is 2 1/4. So I'm going to go along and do, with a series of dashes, I'm going to measure 2 1/4 inches from this edge. Okay, and I'll blend that out with my French curve, if I can find it. Connecting the dots, so to speak. And you can see that this curve here is a little sharp, so I'm going to flatten that a little bit so that it's not quite as difficult to sew. Okay, and then you'll put down your grain line. There's one piece like this. It's the Bustier project. And because it's a facing and controlling that neckline, we want to fuse it. So write fuse on there. Okay, we'll do the same to the back to get your back neck facing. This is a one piece, so you'll just simply trace your lining piece and measure the 2 1/4. And when you're done with that, you'll have your facing pieces for the back and your facing pieces for the front. Okay? So now we want to make our lining piece as pieces. Okay, so we trace our pattern pieces from the support bodice, all the notches and everything. Be sure and transfer your grain before you remove your pattern piece. On this piece. It would be marked in blue because it's lining. So I won't mark it at this time, but I've got my punch holes. So with blue ink, you would mark it as lining. Then you would trace your back. And then we have to subtract the amount of the facing because this height is the height of our support bodice. Okay? We want to make room for this facing. So if you see, you lay in your facing there and trace it just barely, or use a pencil very lightly, because you have to add your seam allowance so that it'll sew to that. So the sew line from this cut edge on your facing, the sew line is 1/2 of an inch up. So if you have seam allowance on your lining, you need to go up to a full inch so that it goes past that sew line. Just like we took off an inch, we're going to add on an inch to this. And you can use your facing pattern to get your shape there. And then the same on this one. Trace your facing. That way you know that it has the same shape as your facing. Come back up an inch. This is removed, and your final lining pattern piece is going to look like this. Center front, side front, and back. And you can see where I have added that inch back up so that I didn't take off too much. So now I have my entire lining and facing unit pattern This is my front facing, my back facing, and then my 2 yokes that I transferred from my drape, my back and my front, which has the labeling on the wrong side, but you can see the blue marking, which indicates lining, and then this facing at the hem and the facing at the neck will be made out of self fabric plus fusing. And that's it.